listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We'll be right back after this message.
Will you fight? No! We will run! And we will live!
Shame on you! This could be the greatest night of our lives. But you're gonna let it be the worst.
And I guarantee a week won't go by in your life you won't regret walking out, letting them get the best of you.
Well, I'm not going home.
We've got too far!
I'm gonna stay right here and fight for this lost cause.
A day may come when the courage of men fails, but it is not this day.
The line must be drawn here. This far, no farther.
I'm not saying it's gonna be easy.
You're gonna work harder than you ever worked before.
But that's fine, we'll just get tougher with it.
If a person grits his teeth and shows real determination,
failure is not an option.
That's how winning is done. Believe me when I say
We can break this army here.
And win just one for the Gipper.
But I say to you, what every warrior has known since the beginning of time.
You've got to get mad.
I mean plumb mad dog mean.
If you would be free men, then you must
Fight to fulfill that promise. Let us
cut out their living guts 1 inch at a time.
And they will know what we can do!
Let no man forget how menacing we are. We are lions.
You're like a big bear, man.
This is your time.
Seize the day.
Never surrender. Victory or death.
That's the Chicago.
Who's with me?
Clap! Clap! Don't let him die! Clap!
All right, let's fly. And gentlemen in England now abed shall know my name is the Lord. When I tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our Independence Day.
Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. One world coming together to bring freedom home. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
This is the people's war. It is our war. We are the fighters. Fight it then. Fight it with all that is in us. And may God defend the right.
Warning! Warning!
We gotta stop them! They're gonna kill us all! See how the trouble you've started? Be they the government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone, or human beings. Time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, by all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported talk radio station, throwing ourselves upon the gears of the machine. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
You calm down the thunder, well now you got it. Right, you tell them I'm coming! And hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Revolution Radio!
Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you back to Ohio Exopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snyder. And I think I got my guest Solon on here. Solon, are you there?
Yes, sir. 1% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Well, let me try that introduction again. This is Ohio Exopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snyder. Solon is going to join me at least for the first hour. Maybe I can even drag him into the second hour. I don't know how much time he has. But we're gonna talk about the Meier case, and we're going to talk about assumptions. And I'm going to read a couple Bible verses here before we get into this, because I think it fits in to our discussion topics tonight. I'm going to read Numbers 31, starting at chapter 15. And to give you a little background information, Moses has sent in the soldiers of Israel to wipe out the Midianites. And they went over and killed all the Midianites. But they came back and they didn't kill the women and the children. And that wasn't Moses' idea. He wanted them to do a complete genocide and wipe everybody out. So it starts out and says, "Have you allowed all the women to live?" he asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and were the means of turning the Israelites away from the Lord in what happened at Peor, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now go kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. So what this verse is saying is they're going to do a basic genocide where they kill all the men, all the women, and all the males of any age, but the young girls who haven't slept with a man, the men of Israel allowed to take for themselves. Now, and the reason I bring this up, Solon, is we're going to discuss the thinking in the Meier case, and we're going to discuss assumptions. But I noticed the older I got, the more I learned about life, the more I particularly learned about the Meier material, it became more and more difficult for me to try to support verses like this. And to me, it doesn't seem reasonable anymore. So I kind of wanted to bounce that off of you and see what your thoughts were.
I don't know. I guess I thought that it sounded like things definitely went a little astray in terms of like equality with men and women. Kind of what I thought when I heard that.
Yeah, to say the least, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And it becomes very hard to argue in favor of genocide, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, today we look at these verses, and the religious person has to kind of justify this and say, well, the people of Midian were very demonic, so they had to kill them, or it would have, the entire earth may have been wiped out or become corrupted or whatever. But then they throw this in, well, they can keep the virgins for themselves. So even that rationale just is thrown out the window, right?
Yeah, I'm like shaking my head here. It's crazy.
I got another one for you that I stumbled over this week that I thought was very, very interesting. And this is Deuteronomy 25:11. Now, this one struck me as so illogical, I just couldn't even... And it's so different because I was a devout Christian, Solon. I don't know if you know that about me.
No, I did not.
Yeah, I was a devout Christian, and I studied all the time. And it became harder and harder for me to logically... Well, you're a computer programmer, right? We're both software engineers. And when you're working on a problem and it isn't going so well, and you're writing a lot of code all the time and you can't seem to plug all the holes?
Yeah.
You know how that happens sometimes? Well,
oh, yeah.
That is what these verses remind me of. Let me read this to you. If two men are fighting, and the wife of one of them comes to rescue her husband from his assailant, and she reaches out and seizes him by the private parts, you shall cut off her hand, show her no pity. Now that to me is the most outrageous, illogical thing. Can you believe that?
No.
I did not make that up.
We're not really sure, but it's wow. To be honest with you, I've been told that you should never take these literally. They need to be like told differently now because that's such an old way of doing things. I was told this by a Christian a week ago.
Well, I think you would have to take that point of view, right? To be reasonable, right?
Yeah, and it was a woman who said this to me.
Oh, interesting.
You can't take it so literally. It doesn't mean that. It needs to be translated differently to match today's time. And I was like, what?
So now this is a big contrast to the Meier writings. And what I'm going to read, and let's talk about this. I want to try to work in you want to talk about assumptions and something else. What was the other thing you were talking about?
Basically, beliefs and assumptions they're both very similar.
Well, this is that works into the verses that we just covered. If you go on belief, then you can rationalize those verses. But if you're trying to be logical and reasonable, it becomes very difficult to, you know what I'm saying? Please comment.
You know, when you read that, I was instantly like, so people aren't supposed to be, have sympathy when it says don't have any pity.
Right.
I was like, that's crazy. I don't even know if I could chop a person's hand off, but
it's ridiculous. Now imagine what must have taken place. 20 or 30 men suddenly rush this poor woman down, tackle her, hold her down. One of them gets a big hatchet or whatever and cuts her hand off. And then she bleeds. Somehow they must have been able to stop the bleeding so she wouldn't die. And can you imagine how gory and absurd that is?
You know, I'm going to be honest with you. I remember I was in a German chat room. I was there with, whenever through my journey of learning German, I have met people from all around the world. And I actually met a person who was from Syria. And he was telling me that before the Prophet Muhammad came in there, they acted like barbarians. And he was aware that this guy must have brought, something that changed them when they went through their golden age. And he was telling me that the way they were digging, they were burying their wives alive and stuff. He was telling me all these things, and I was like getting a little sick in my stomach as he was telling me some of the barbarian things they were doing to their family members.
Why were they burying their wife alive?
I don't know. I didn't question it. He had told me too much where I started becoming kind of sick in myself, where I didn't really want to discuss this with him much, but I wanted to talk about the Prophet Muhammad and what he knew about him, because this guy was very educated.
Now, according to the Meier information, Muhammad was one of the previous personalities of Edward Albert Meier, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, isn't that interesting? One of the most interesting things I find with the Meier case is this whole idea of his previous personalities. And when he went up on the ship with Svath as a young boy, one of the first things that Svath told him was about his previous personalities. Wouldn't that be amazing to go up on a ship with a very advanced extraterrestrial person and they tell you about your previous personalities?
There's a couple people that I know that like to label people as like, oh, they must have been this in a past life. And, I thought it was kind of cool at first, but then I started to think, I think it plays too much into the ego. So I think for someone to tell you such a thing, they must know that you can handle it.
Oh, wow. So in other words, you're saying Svath knew that Billy was okay with this information.
Yeah, he had to have known that Billy was, his word was good, that he could accept certain things and it wouldn't change him. He could think about it and become balanced within himself when he heard these things.
Very interesting. I need to learn more about Billy's life as Muhammad, and I think there's some passages in some of the contact reports about that. Isn't that correct?
I haven't read all of them. I'm not sure. I can't say that I have come across any such a thing. I just, within the goblet of the truth, it talks about the prophet, and we know all these are the Nocodamian spirit forms, the prophets, of course, which are just teachers of the Lear. Hold on, let me put this in English. The teaching of love, teaching of wisdom, teaching of the spirit.
One interesting part about reincarnation is the spirit form enters into the body of, I guess you would call it the embryo, at 21 days, and it brings in the new personality and the mentality, the material consciousness, and that spirit form is a fragment of the universal consciousness. Could you talk about the spirit form a little bit?
Yeah, so you're aware that it resides within the middle part of the brain. Was that the superior colliculus? Is that how you say it?
Yep, that's correct.
And from there, it's kind of outside. I guess you could say it's part of the fine matter world in the sense that it has connection with that side, but it's layered on top of or I should say maybe underneath. Well, it's layered with the material world. And within this, oh man, I mean, there's a lot to this. But yeah, so it resides within the middle brain of the human being, and it animates us. That's the most simplest way to put it without going too far into detail, unless I should go further in detail, of course.
I like what you said there about the spirit form having a connection with the spirit realm or the immaterial world. Is that how you put it?
Yeah, well, it's the fine matter. I guess I'm trying to make it too simple, but it's the fine matter or the I'll just call it the fine matter. You have matter, which is the physical, and then you have the fine matter, which we would say, the spiritual matter, but that's not what it is in the Meier case. It's called the fine matter.
That's really interesting because I like the way you put that the spirit form is still kind of connected to the fine matter world, because somewhere I read that the spirit form stays within its own realm, even though it's in the body of the human being. Yeah, which I thought, how fascinating is that?
Oh yeah, very, very fascinating.
Now, there's also a part of the spirit form called the Gemut, and it says here, it looks after the spirit consciousness-based feelings and the spirit consciousness-based thoughts in itself. Now that's very interesting because our spirit form, the Meier material says, isn't completely aware, yet it still has spirit consciousness-based thoughts and spirit consciousness-based feelings, which I think is also very, very interesting.
Yeah, this has actually been disputed amongst some people that I know. It's caused some conflicts.
Oh, really?
I feel like this is more of like an evolutive thing where it becomes aware, but we're just not to that point yet.
Right.
So until then, we're in the physical world, which is like one of the lowest, in terms of the seven. There's 7 evolutions in that, and then there's 7 evolutions in the fine matter world. But to me, the Gemut is similar to the psyche of the human being. So anything that you have in the material, you also have on the spiritual side. So there is a counterpart for both.
Yeah, I remember the first time I tried reading the book, The Psyche. I mean, I read like the first 20 pages over like 15 times at least, trying to ingrain in my thick skull these concepts, because I just knew they were very profound, and I knew I was only getting like 0.05% each time I would read it.
Yeah, well, I imagine it was probably even harder for you coming from a Christian background than for me. than myself.
So you don't have a Christian background?
Well, I was raised for about the first 6 years of my life, and then my parents split. And during this split, there was not really enough time to really be part of, because my dad worked the entire week, and then his weekends he wanted to just relax.
Sure.
And that typically didn't mean going anywhere. So naturally, I never went back to the church.
You know, it's so interesting. I have very many, Christian friends who I still feel a connection to, but I never felt comfortable going to any churches. I always felt like something was way out of balance, and I don't even like going in those kind of buildings now, because he talks about the fine fluido energies, and just not comfortable. Doesn't feel right in there.
Yeah. So people who are aware of these things, they're definitely impulsed when they're around these things and of all these beliefs and whatnot. And then a person who has come to grips with some of the reality knows that some of this is unhealthy. And then when you're in there, you're getting conflicts with the environment and yourself. So naturally, you wouldn't want to be in there.
Do you remember Billy talking about going into some of those old cathedrals in Switzerland? And I think one of them he went into and he almost died.
Yeah.
Because there were so many, all of our thoughts, our thoughts are so powerful that they even remain sometimes after we die. And the fine fluido energies of our thoughts are like stored in the furniture and the walls of the house, and particularly in those old churches and cathedrals where how many hundreds of funerals have taken place in there, and other things that caused bad feelings and bad thoughts. So it's just like a magnet, and you're walking into something that's really unhealthy, completely unhealthy.
To be honest with you, I feel like this might be one of the reasons why in the Meier case, the Pleiadians have a hard time being around us Earth humans, because we're like also admitting these things where they, would take these things in, and it would just be so damaging because it would be so powerful. So many of us
having wrong thoughts.
Yes. Harmful thoughts or whatnot. Yeah.
Well, let me read this one passage quickly. And this describes what I call the chain reaction of wrong thinking. And there's a whole lot of cause and effect here. It says, this is in contrast to when tangled ideas confuse the thoughts and abruptly go from one extreme to another, whereby a misdirection of thoughts arises, which triggers emotions and can even lead to murder and manslaughter. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, when I hear that, it makes me think of like schizophrenia, which I've dealt with some of my family members, and they can become so paranoid about something that's not taking place that causes them to want to murder somebody because they believe that's them doing it. And in reality, you talk to those people and they're like, "Look, I'm scared of your dad. I don't even go around him. I don't go around his house. He's just paranoid."
That's so interesting. I had a family member call me a couple of weeks ago, and they were upset about something I had said 6 months ago to someone else, and they actually broke into tears and hung up on me, and then called back and then tried, left this long, nasty message. But I can, it's just this stored up wrong thinking. It's just, just now, with my time in the Meier case and being able to clear my own thoughts, I can look on that and really just have compassion for them.
Yeah. Well, that's good that you have compassion, whereas they had retaliation.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't think people realize that, they're generating these things, and by holding them in and then bringing them back up, and that they cause their downfall. And just what you said.
Well, let me continue here to the next verse. It says, there is no room for rationality and virtue in these tangled irrationality and basically wrong ideational thoughts, because only rationality and virtuelessness govern in highly emotional forms for which truthfully a setting of the zeal and an imagination of the realization of a zeal are foreign. This is one of these sentences that Billy has, which it's so huge, you have to break it into chunks and analyze it. He said ideational thoughts. Now, Billy talks about a difference between an idea, IDEA, and ideals, IDEALS, where the latter, ideals are completely thought through and rational, whereas the idea is unripe, underdeveloped. Can you contrast those two thoughts?
This is actually new to me, only because I wish you said like the two German words. So I've never this is where my English falls apart with the Meier case.
Do you have the Might of Thoughts nearby?
No, not nearby.
Okay.
I really wish I did so I could see these two. But when I see this one, it seems like one of them is an imagination. And then one of them is like, when you're looking at reality and you're trying to understand what's going on.
Yeah, Billy talks, here later. Let me read it. This is way down at the bottom of the page.
Oh.
He says here, hang on. But that means that in the one case, just as in the other, corresponding thoughts are nurtured, which are directed in one way or another, and in every case come to fruition by means of the might. It thereby just depends on whether it is in righteousness or unrighteousness, and whether ideas are simply lived out, or ideas are formed into ideals, IDEALS, and are brought to fruition. So I had to analyze this, and there's more. It says more about this in this chapter, but he says an idea has values and unvalues. And unvalues are things like pathological angriness and inability to have deep feelings for people and irrational behavior. These are unvalues. So when you have these incomplete ideas, IDEAS, they usually have what are called unvalues in them. Have you, this would be a great thing with your knowledge of German. Me and you are going to have to go over this someday.
Oh, I'd love to. I don't know. I haven't studied all the Might of the Thoughts. I would say that book is extremely concentrative on this subject.
This book is, I remember reading this book for the first time going, oh my goodness, I read a sentence and I think I understood 1% of what it really says. That was my experience anyway. So here I am. I'm reading it 10 years later and finally starting to dissect all of the different, more of the nuances here. Let me see if I can. Okay, let me read a little bit this to you. Let me get your input. In fact, only a following of ideas occurs, from which a setting of the zeal can never result in any wise, because just the idea alone is followed without it being able to be made into an ideal, IDEAL. Therefore, a murderer or despot, for example, only pursues his or her unripe ideas, from which he or she is never able to make an ideal, IDEAL, that is to say, a healthy, positive determination, because he or she remains caught up in the idea, IDEA, and does not come free of it. So in other words, these incomplete, unripe ideas, they hold us, they like grab us, and we cannot free ourselves from them.
Maybe because you haven't actually, it sounds like what it is you started something but have not finished it. Like you only know half the meaning. That that was actually a trait of a psychopath, is they would start something but they wouldn't finish it.
Really?
Yeah, it was kind of like, whoa, that's an interesting concept. One
of the other characteristics of a psychopath, or unvalues as they call them, is boredom.
Oh gosh.
When I was a kid, I was bored all the time. I'm not bored now, but I was bored a lot.
Yeah, me too. I remember that feeling.
I was going down the wrong path.
Yeah.
Now, we kind of taken a side tangent, as we always do. You wanted to talk a little bit about assumptions. I think this overlaps with what...
Definitely.
Okay, go ahead. I'll let you roll a little bit there. I derailed you a tad. I'm sorry about that.
No. This is great. I actually, I've never heard of this from the Mind of Thought, so I was like trying to think about it really hard, but I wish I had it in front of me.
Page 224.
Of the English?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I just know if someone has just the German, then that wouldn't be the same page. So I was making sure it was. Well, of course you had the English. Yeah, I should have realized. All right.
Yeah. I'm not good enough to read in just the German. Well, there's some other interesting stuff in here, but I'm going to let you go ahead before I start.
Did you finish? Did you finish? Well, I mean, it's best that you finish these thinking, so it can flow within each individual person that listens.
Well, let me just say this. Now, this is the German, so this will ring with you. When I first read this, I was like, what is he talking about? And I even had a little bit of a, I don't know if you call it a crisis or whatever, but it's like, it's hard to put into words. Let me read it and then I can put it into words. It says, therefore, it is necessary to search for the source of the life power and to develop the power in order to have a reliable life potential upon which one can depend, therefore in which one can completely trust. The source of the life power, which must be created by oneself, lies in the consciousness, that is to say, the thoughts, which must be formed, tended, and nurtured. And then he goes on. But when I read that, I'm like, how in the heck am I going to create this life power? So I looked at the German word for life power, and it's Lebenskraft.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So evidently, our thinking, when it's right, when it's correct, enhances our life power.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Which makes perfect sense now, but didn't at the time, believe me.
Well, if you've ever paid attention to a person who is depressed, you'll see that their thoughts are destructive of themselves. So they're actually destroying themselves. So if you were to look at the opposite of this, if a person who is thinking healthy of themselves and their environment, they would be uplifting themselves and thus giving life power.
I have this little mantra that I have developed, and it's from the book, The Might of Thoughts. And I tell myself I'm confident, I'm optimistic, I'm relaxed, I'm cheerful, I'm enthusiastic. I'm the master of my own destiny, the forger of my own fortune, the creator of my own good luck. I do not allow my thoughts to drift. I steer my thoughts like a captain steers his ship. I nurture my thoughts, I strengthen my thoughts, I clarify my thoughts. It is the nature of the thoughts that by their might alone, every conceivable thing can be brought to fruition. Now, there's more to it, but I say that a lot to myself over and over and over again in the mornings, because a lot of times when I'm susceptible to depression or negativity is in the mornings for whatever reason. I don't know if I'm tired when I wake up or what, but can you comment on that?
No, that sounds great, Mark. This might sound a little strange, but when people start doing prayers at like Thanksgiving, which just happened for me, I'll actually do something very similar to that. Whenever they go into a prayer, I'll do my own prayer, and it sounds very similar to that.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, this way you have control over what you're saying to yourself and not some other person. So that's just me, though.
That's interesting because you recognize, in other words, you have enough introspection to look inside yourself. And when they start to say these prayers, you're recognizing that you're having uncomfortable feelings because maybe these thoughts don't line up with the truth, and you're just trying to stay in control of your own thoughts, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely susceptible to another person's if you're just kind of listening and then you repeat it back to yourself, then you're definitely saying that back to yourself as well.
Mm.
You
Yeah,
know?
there's so much wrong thinking today. It's like an epidemic.
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I see it as though we're leaving the age of Pisces and we're going into the age of Aquarius, and that helps me understand it. But that's only because I've studied astrology.
Well, I like that. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Well, I mean, you know, what's kind of strange because I'm a Pisces, and I've had to study what is a Pisces really, you know, and first and foremost, I started to realize that that they're kind of like almost feeling based. They have intuition, but they're very unclear about their things. They're kind of lost in fantasy, it seems.
That's
and
interesting.
Yeah, and when you kind of look at religion, it's like, well, it has these qualities to it. And then you look at like Aquarius, that's like, this thinking, this ability to just to research and understand, and this expansion of this, you really get an idea that, okay, so that's this energy. I mean, we wouldn't have gotten to this point if it wasn't for somebody trying to understand nature, whereas the Pisces might have just been thinking about it and never really doing much else with it besides turning it into like a sci-fi or fantasy.
One of the most important things that I learned in the book, The Might of Thoughts, is this ability to clarify, to nurture my thoughts, to strengthen them.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes away all confusion, I've noticed. It has helped me in my job. I'm sure of it, because I can't even remember my thinking going back, maybe even a year or two. There's a lot of, for people that are listening to the show, there's a lot of pressure sometimes with the world of computer programming, because every day you have to solve a problem that maybe no one else, probably someone else could help you with it, but you're in a constant state where you're facing unknowns all the time. And if your thinking goes wrong, you can really self-sabotage yourself. If you get yourself in that, uncertain frame of mind, it's like all your problem solving just collapses. So this material has helped me and strengthened me so much to have clarity and to stay focused and just be neutral. It didn't matter if I've been working on a problem for 2 hours and hadn't really made that much progress. Now I just enjoy it. Hopefully I'll keep this state of mind.
Can I share mine?
Sure.
I'm actually I work for a small company and I do all the programming.
Oh my goodness.
Well,
That's
sounds
even worse.
Well, well, here's the thing. I didn't like programming with a bunch of different people because they would do a certain part and you had to match it up with theirs.
Yeah.
And if you thought very differently, it was very hard. Where with me, I would write the whole thing and I would go outside and pace and I would execute the code in myself and up and down the road, and I would start seeing errors. Even though the program was on the computer, I had executed all the functions and whatnot inside my head.
Oh,
I've been programming since I was in middle school. So
wow.
It's not like it's a new concept to understand, programming. And you're right that if you ever get so frustrated, it will like consume you and it cause so much stress that you want to give up. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, the company I'm working for, the software is very, very complicated. I'll say that much. We have about 120 or 130 different customers, and every customer has their own database instance. I shouldn't say instance, schema. Mm-hmm. And our software has options and parameters, so it's configurable. So all these different customers have different configurations. So it's a very successful company too. They're They're growing. I mean, we're hiring sometimes, I think, too many people. We're buying other companies. And we have a very fast software cycle, a 2-week cycle. So every 2 weeks, you are responsible for another set of deliverables that go to production. And 2.5 years ago, when I was hired, you talk about stress. I mean, I got to tell you this. This software does automated phone calls, you know, to like you. Well, I'm not going to say much more than that. I don't want to give away the company. But
sounds like Google Assistant.
Huh?
Sounds like Google Assistant.
No, I don't know. But the whole foundation of the company was built on these C programs that would talk to these boards that were configured to make phone calls and get phone calls and things like that. Well, that hardware was literally, the company that made that hardware went out of business. And these boards, you couldn't even buy them anymore. Oh. So when I was hired, you know, I figured they would bring me into something small. You know, I would do a little change here, a little change there. No, I was on like a small team. There was only 3 of us that had to convert all of that code that does these phone calls, this low-level C code, convert it to JavaScript, and we're using another library that does the phone calls and stuff. So, oh my goodness, I can remember I would work 7 days a week every month, you know, for months and months, because there was such a learning curve I had to get up. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I thought this was, and if it wasn't for the Might of Thoughts, if it wasn't for the book, The Might of Thoughts, I don't think I could have done it.
It sounds like you gained a lot from this experience.
I have.
And that's the important part.
Yes, it is. But I tell you what, so what do you study mostly in the Meier? You're not full-time on the Might of Thoughts. Are you on the Way to Live, or what are you focused on mostly?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I kind of read a little bit here and there. I want to learn the Om. But the problem is there's words in there that aren't in any of the other books, and so then I have to go ask a German, and you know, because I don't know where I can find a middle German or high German dictionary yet. So I have to ask them, like, what is der Willen, and then they'll tell me. But I would say on my own, I am studying the Way to Live.
Okay. Most people that I know are studying the Way to Live.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Well, I think it's one of those books that has many different topics where the mind of the thought is so compact. It's like, I don't know how much more I can think about the thoughts right now. You know, you just want to put the book down.
It's like a PhD dissertation, you know, or something. It's hard to describe. You know, it's the only book that I've ever read where I will say this about myself. Usually I do better to read just one page, and I can spend a half an hour on just that one page rather than skimming over it, because I cannot get much from skimming over this material. It's, you know what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, I think that's why I like the Om Canon 32. They're like sentences that are just compact. Or I mean, at one point it was describing the difference between Mitleid and I should say them in English, shouldn't I? It was describing the difference between sympathy and empathy, and it went into a clarification where, like, one of them was like, you know, you felt bad for someone, and then the other one was you felt their pain, so you were taking in their pain and causing damage to yourself.
Oh.
And I was like, I'd never noticed this, but that's true. And I still suffer with this sometimes.
I do. So empathy, you're taking in their pain?
Yes. You take on their pain, as you can feel the pain where they have it.
You know something? I definitely have done that before. A lot.
You do damage when that happens to yourself. I mean, that's the power of your thought. If you think about it, you're literally feeling their pain.
And you're almost manufacturing it in a way.
Yeah, but you still feel the pain as though it's happening to you.
Oh,
so you're not the observer anymore. You're the participation in their own pain.
You know, in our last show, we started talking about Empfindung or Empfindungen, and we were talking about. I was talking about, you know, when I was a kid, I would, you know, my parents were driving through a certain neighborhood or whatever, and I get this really bad feeling, and I thought everybody had these kind of feelings, but you had mentioned experiencing the same thing.
Oh yeah. And I never forgot mine either, so that's kind of funny. You didn't forget yours.
Oh yeah, it's profoundly impacting, and I don't know if it's the fluido energies I'm picking up on, or have you read anything about that in the Meier material?
Well, believe it or not, this might sound a little crazy, but after talking to you, I started to realize, like, man, you know, I did a little bit of assumptions about certain things. I need to go back and reread this myself, and I did with another FIGU member actually, so we could discuss it.
Okay.
And that's kind of how I started to, like, when I started to tell you about the spirit, I started to realize, like, I wanted to talk about that, and then I was like, well, let's just make it basic, so for people who hear it, they can understand it. But I mean, there really isn't anything, because the word spirit has. To me, it has so many different meanings in each individual person. So, where it's, you know, it's to me, it's just, you know, this part piece inside you that's part of creation, of course, in the mental brain, and it's really controlled through the conscience. But in the infant, it's the counterpart to your thoughts, and the spiritual, in this fine matter world. Have you ever looked at the graft? There's a graft on how each layer works.
Please send me that link someday. Or
okay.
If you can.
Yeah, it's on Creational Truth. Patrick's done a really great job with. He's got it like nice and colorful and all. It's really beautiful. He's done a great job with so much.
I think I've seen it before, and he has done a great job with those diagrams. They're awesome.
Of course, there's also one in one of Billy's books as well.
Really?
The infinite is part of the spiritual. To me, well, I'm not. I shouldn't assume things, but to me, it's when you look at that, it's almost like it's a mirror, and you can fold the piece of paper and you can see that they both match up, but they're at different levels, almost like like, for instance, the coarse matter world, opposites attract. But in the fine matter world, it pairs itself up with similarity. So if you think, well, I shouldn't say if you think negative, because, I mean, that might not necessarily make it there, but it's only thinking in a neutral positive way. So as in this, we can attract both the negative and the positive in our thoughts, but it only has the positive being sent or being thought about.
Well, that's interesting.
Or well, I should say, yeah, I should just say that it attracts the similar in the fine matter world, where here in the course we can attract the opposites attract. For instance, can I give an example?
Sure, go ahead.
So me and a friend watched a documentary called Cleanup. Are you familiar with this? It's very new.
No, I don't think so.
PBS aired it 2 weeks ago, I think, and it was about Facebook, their cleanup. A lot of people are posting images on Facebook that are inappropriate, and what happens is people report it, and it goes to a team within Facebook. And these people it gets sent to whatever one, depending on whatever you select, and it gets sent to them. And what happens is these people are constantly looking at people dying, killing themselves, or pornographic material. And the people, it was kind of interesting. One of the guys that constantly kept watching suicide ended up committing suicide. And that's what I mean, that the positive, or what you see eventually is exactly what it's conveying to itself. So eventually he probably got an impulse to kill himself because he was feeding this back to himself.
My goodness.
And it's so sad because we don't understand how these things work.
I saw a similar kind of thing on Facebook one time. It's been 2 or 3 years ago. It was horrific. And I've never forgotten it. And I wish I hadn't seen it in the first place. I'm not going to repeat what it was. But it was horrific. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. I'm sure there's plenty of that on the internet.
And why do people put it on Facebook? That's so twisted.
Well, actually, it was even telling in there that some people, when you say the internet, that's all they think of is Facebook, because that's what the internet is to them. That's what Facebook has come in so many places, is the internet. That's where you go for your news, for your interaction, and that's the sad part in certain parts of this planet.
And I get a real negative vibe from Facebook anymore. I can't stay on there very long.
Yeah, I actually don't. I no longer post, but the problem with it is that I know a lot of FIGU members that are on there, and they'll post things under certain groups, and I benefit greatly because I feel like I'm part of a community of people who are trying to figure things out and have similar interests to me.
Yeah.
So I find that to be enjoyable, but that's pretty much what I use it for.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Gosh, talk about changing the subject. I don't even know if I should go here now. We've only got like 10 minutes left in the first hour. And then I'm gonna
really?
Yeah.
It's
and then we're
been that long?
Yeah.
Wow.
And then I'm going to bring on Frosty Wooldridge. And do you have time to stick around, or do you need to leave?
Yeah, no, I can stick around. I love Frosty.
Do you?
Yeah, man. I'm so happy that guy is talking about overpopulation. Anytime somebody talks about it, I'm happy because it needs to be talked about.
It does, doesn't it? We've got to face the reality.
We do.
Let me send you a link real quick. And this is how many people die from hunger each year. And
I think that 1 million people die in India from hunger.
According to this website, and I'll let people choose what they think or whatever. Let me put it in the chat here.
See it.
Yeah. See if you can see it.
I'm actually on my phone, but I'm gonna do my best to look at it here.
Oh, if you can't, you can't. Don't worry about it. It's a counter. I'm seeing your Skype name pop up, Paul. It's weird. It's like you're just coming online or something.
Oh, I just opened the phone up. Maybe that's why. I don't know.
32 million, they say, die every year.
Wow.
Yeah. That's 1 billion people suffer from hunger every year. This means 1 in 6 people on the earth don't get enough food to live a healthy life. And we're increasing our population. That's how insane. It's so insane.
There was a French guy that, oh man, I wish I knew his name. He actually equated the energy problem that the USA kind of dodged, whereas a lot of the other countries have gone through it, where the energy is on a decline. We've kind of peaked energy. I think people have probably heard this. They don't think they understand the repercussions of it. And this guy used a lot of great logic, which was really strange because about 20 seconds of this presentation, which was an hour long, he talked about at one point everything was sustainable when the population was at 500,000.
500 million?
Oh, maybe, yes. I'm sorry, 500 million. I always when it's downplayed, I always downplay it, and then I always end up saying like 800 trillion. I don't know why I do that. Yes.
Yeah, the whole overpopulation thing. Have you heard me talk about giving everybody a cow to eat?
Yes.
And what happens there, where you get 14 million acres to support the cows, and that equates into about 20 million square miles, which is all of South America and all the United States and all of Canada and all Alaska and all of Russia. So we have Europe and we have Africa and China left, but then we still haven't grown any of their vegetables or anything yet. So this is the kind of, when people say you can fit all 7 billion people into Texas, well, yeah, but it's going to take another 20 million square miles to feed them, and we're not taking into consideration, how you're going to make these people's clothes. Are you going to give them automobiles? How are you going to manufacture, cell phones and computers and the whole 9 yards? So there's so many things left out of that equation. When people say put 7 billion people in Texas, it's so absurd.
Mark, you think I could read this thing that I wrote about assumptions? It actually talks about a little bit of this.
Sure,
not necessarily population, but kind of the current events.
Sure, we got about 8 minutes. So if you hear the music, stop, and I'll have to bring Frosty in.
All right, it shouldn't take 8 minutes just to read this part.
Okay.
So this is from Billy Had Two Visions. So this is recent, during 2017. This is a translation from Figu, Australia, and it's titled "A Look at the Present, 2017, and the Future Developing from It." And there was a certain part that this has basically, it talks about the globalists realizing that overpopulation is a real thing and creating some type of airborne, skin-borne illness that goes inside the human beings and tries to kill them all.
Mm-hmm.
But he said before that'll happen, and then he gives like a list of, I think it's like 50 or maybe 70, I forgot now, of things that'll happen before that. So people can go back. But before he gets into the list, he said something that I thought should be repeated over and over and over to people. And it was this part. And I'm constantly like trying to, keep this in my brain to help people. So here's how it goes. It says, the human being of the earth, wake up from your twilight sleep. Begin to think for yourself and use intellect and rationality in order to also stop globalization, which is bringing further terribleness, which has progressed so far already through capitalism, and indeed, especially through capitalist bosses and their money greedy machinations. That also nature is involved in destructive ways, and is brought into an uproar. Therefore, the entire terrestrial population, that is, the entire humanity, must finally learn to think independent and clearly, and not allow the elite and political parties, as well as the capitalist mighty ones, to think for them, but rather to make an effort entirely for themselves to think independently. And independent thinking based in the human being, on the one hand, searching for information from many different sources and collecting as much as possible, and on the other hand, to compare it and to draw his or her own conclusion from it. Independent thinking is not only desirable, rather it must be the human being's duty. Consequently, he or she must demand it of him or herself, whereby this ought to...
There's the music. We'll be back in 5 minutes, folks.
Radio at freedomslips.com. And we'll be right back after this message.
Travels to Earth through the rainbow crystal bubbles from the furthest reaches of space and time, across the dimensions, through the elements, and in harmony with the colors of the universe. Through her mastery of abstract stream of consciousness malapropisms, she weaves a web of comic, satiric, cosmic conversation. Her subjects can range from Norman, the goose next door, to astrology and earth changes, and into the deep recesses of the soul matrix. She holds a wealth of knowledge on herbs, plants, and astrology. Join Mona and her guests on adventures of a feral hippie as she touches the earthly radio waves 5 days a week at 2 p.m. Monday to Friday on Studio B at Revolution Radio.
Transcending time and space, let us take you to the place inside your mind where thoughts divide and mysteries unwind. Join us every Monday evening right here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. And you will catch the Fenton Perspective with our great host, Lorian Fenton. Come listen in as she shares her amazing stories from the past to present, along with all of her guest secrets to the future. That's the Fenton Perspective every Monday evening right here from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, only on Revolution Radio. Oh, and you don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Who are we? Where do we come from? Are you curious about the origins of the human race? Join me, Gavin McCall, and a variety of guests on Ancient Humans, where we decipher world events, explore scientific theories, personal stories, myths, mysteries, and lore about the history of the human race.
Here. Hey, Frosty, stand by.
Everybody, he's a Veg, hooked inside the eye live. Before the Sunday mainstream media political pundit talk shows, there is Inside the Eye Live, where we break down some of the weekly mainstream media talking points before the talking points even get aired. Add in some entertaining stories, weather, cats, intriguing and informative guests, and you get one of the most listened to Saturday morning streaming media political talk shows going today. And it's all right here on our flagship station, Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. So join me, the Fetch, for Inside the Eye Live every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern. It is truly intelligent media for the politically aware.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you back to Ohio Exopolitics. The second hour, I've got Frosty Wooldridge on. Frosty, how are you today?
Doing very well, and just a happy post-Thanksgiving to everyone. I hope that it was a positive time with your family and friends around the table, and of course the turkey and the trimmings, and really the fellowship. That, to me, is the most important thing. in these holiday season, just for all of us to be with friends, to be with family, to be with the ones that make our life purposeful and supported. So just a happy Thanksgiving. And then, of course, now the Christmas rush is on. For me, I'm not out buying all sorts of things. I just want to share my time with my friends, and I hope they want to share it with me. And that's the biggest Christmas of all.
Frosty got a friend on. His name is Solon, and he's very interested in the problem of overpopulation and immigration as well. So he may have a few questions for you too.
I'd love to. That's great. One of the things that I hope that this program, with Mark Snyder and guests, is to create a national conversation and a national debate on what we're going to do with our civilization and what we're going to hand over to our kids. And the key for me is the more people that jump into this conversation and this debate, the better it is. And I hope it goes viral at some point where it's the number one news feed across all of the big networks, certainly CNN and Fox and ABC and CBS and NBC, but also NPR and PBS, because as most of you know, this is the most suppressed, most ignored issue here in the 21st century, but it is the most important issue facing not only America, but certainly Canada and the rest of the world. And so this is great to have somebody added to the conversation today.
Well, the first thing I'd like for you to talk about, Frosty, is the migrant caravan. I saw a little discussion Bill O'Reilly had with one of the other Fox people, and they've been tracing this down, and there's a group out of Chicago that has a Spanish name, something family, that is located in Chicago, that gets about $2.5 million per year from George Soros. And that's the group that's financing this migrant caravan. And I mean, these people are being brought up in trucks. They're being given food. They're being given drugs, and probably even some clothes along the way. So why don't you just take that and run with it a little bit if you can?
Okay, well, thank you. One of the things that most people don't understand and don't really have, it's not on the front burner, if you will, and that is the fact that Mexico has 1/5 of America's landmass, and so much of that 1/5 of America's landmass is arid desert. I mean, I've traveled all over Mexico myself personally. I've seen it. And Mexico right now has 123 million people. That's 123 million people on 1/5 the landmass of the United States. And unfortunately, a great deal, I don't know, a third to even more than third of all that is just plain desert. And so what you're talking about there in Mexico is carrying capacity. And for those of you who don't know this, somewhere around 15 to 18 million Mexicans have illegally migrated into the United States, simply because there is no way to employ them. The illiteracy rates are so great, and you can only have so much, so many jobs for redundant labor. Redundant labor is farm labor, labor that's sweeping the broom or roofing the house or doing landscape. And unfortunately, all of Mexico is on course to hit 140 million. Or more by the year 2050, which is only 32 years from now. Well, the same thing's happening in Honduras. If you look at the population of Honduras or El Salvador or Nicaragua or any of those Central American countries, their populations have doubled in the last 40 years. And because they have doubled, they've outrun their carrying capacity also. So then you have the consequences of illiteracy, because you can't teach these people. You can't even have schools. You simply don't have educators. And for those of you who have followed me, not only on my writings and so forth, you knew that I started out my life as a math and science teacher here in Denver, Colorado, back in the early 70s, in fact, 1973. And with that reality, there's no end to the line of desperate people And of course, we already know that the United States takes in over 1.7 million people every year right now that are also desperate, and from all of these different countries around the world, about 196 of them actually. And that 1.7, about 1.2 million are legal immigrants, and the other 500,000 are illegal. And of course, we now know from the Yale study, Mark, and every person listening, please understand this. The Yale study has really corrected the government and the latest media reports that we only have 11 million people. Well, of course, that's been told to us for the last 15 to 20 years now, when in fact, when you start adding up 1.7 million crossing over into America every year, that really makes it a whole lot more. And you also have to understand that they're having 900,000 babies every year. So that's the baby production. So we now understand from the Yale research study that was just published this fall that we have 22 to 25 million illegal aliens in the United States of America. And they're so happy to be here because the welfare systems, the educational system, the food stamp systems, the medical systems, which you and I pay for as full-time working Americans, are footing the bill for that. And that's been going on now for 30 years. And Frosty. So you have to also appreciate that when Barack Obama was president, he allowed 65,000 children who got escorted up here, whether it was Soros or whomever it might have been, and they got absorbed in the United States. And of course, that was the harbinger of what we're facing right now, an endless line of caravans and an endless line of desperate people trying to get to the USA.
Thank you for that very much, Frosty. I'm going to just leave the show in your capable hands, and Solon, if you have any questions, please ask Frosty. I'm going to step away just for a second, check on my dogs, and keep doing what you're doing, Frosty. I know you can talk about this all night. I'll be right back, guys. Thanks.
Solon, yeah, thank you. Solon, would you like to just jump in real quick and let's kind of get a theme going, because I think we're going to be here for the next 6 or 7 months on this, and I think it's important that your thoughts and ideas also commingle with mine and Mark's and every person out there in the audience across the country.
Well, okay. Well, I kind of have a question for you. How did you feel about the Chinese one baby policy? I guess that's what they call it, right? One child.
Yeah, one child per family. That started in 1979, and I traveled throughout China in 1984. I actually got to see the old China. And as a teacher, you all know, for those of you who don't know, I was able to travel on a bicycle for the last 47 years across 6 continents now, and certainly 13 times across the United States. So you all know that I really love to pedal a bicycle. I'm really a physical fitness nut, but I'm also an academic who carries my notebook with me at all times. And in 1984, when I got to China and Hong Kong, I was appalled by the extraordinary overpopulation situation that was there. And then I worked my way right into China, all the way up to the Wall of China. I went through Hangzhou, I went through Shanghai, I went through Kulin, I went through all these cities across China. And the one thing that just absolutely astounded me, in fact, blew my mind, and then it changed my entire worldview, was the fact that at the time, China featured about 1.15 billion people. They're now at 1.4 billion. And when I saw that, then of course I went into India, and they're now at 1.25 billion. And of course, places like Bangladesh have a population of 161 million people in a landmass the size of less than the size of Iowa. So you can imagine me on a kit, and I was on a bicycle, and I'm traveling through all of these amazing places, and people are stacked on top of each other. And so China, because it's a communist country and it's a complete dictatorship, it mandated in 1979, it knew it was going to go over a demographic cliff, and it said, okay, one child per family. And so that was the rule, and that is the only thing that saved them from another probably 500 million people right now that would be overflowing China even further, and they would be headed toward 2 billion. And so, on a moral level, you can say it's a terrible thing, but on a logical, rational level of living within the carrying capacity of the landmass, the leaders of China were absolutely forced to create a one child per family mandate. And in fact, I have, for the entire human race, which is now at 7.6 billion, and a lot of my articles, and especially my new book that's coming out in March, America's Overpopulation Predicament, Blindsiding Future Generations, I'm asking for a worldwide discussion on a one child per woman mandate, if you will, or certainly some kind of an international choice, because if we don't start doing it by ourselves and literally stabilizing human population, Mother Nature is going to do it for us. And so that's kind of how I look at it, Solon.
I totally agree with that. Do you also think that border control for the countries that don't allow this said one-child policy?
Yeah, there's no question. Okay, let's go back to 1970. Here I am, a college kid. I'm in my senior year, and I graduate from Michigan State University. And I must say, Ohio State's beating the pants off of Michigan today. But of course, I went to Michigan State University. But anyway, what happened on Earth Day was that all first world countries, being a little more educated and a little more understanding that population was the gravest condition, the gravest factor facing the human race back in 1970 when we had 3.5 billion people. And so the first world nations, America, certainly Canada, all of Europe, all of Australia, certainly places like New Zealand and other first world countries started having 2 children per woman. In fact, 2.03 here in the United States starting in 1970. And even dropping down to about 1.9 right now. And yet the third world screamed ahead, continued to have 6, 8, 10 babies. And so they added another 4.1 billion. The third world added 4.1 billion people. We're now at 7.6 billion, headed for 10 billion. And so now all of these overpopulated countries are screaming to break down borders and crash into these first world countries who were very responsible starting in 1970. And now they want to save themselves by migrating into these first world countries. One way or the other, it's going to stop very soon. It's going to stop either legally or it's going to stop with violence. But at some point, all of Europe is going to shut their borders. Certainly Canada is going to shut its borders at some time, and obviously so will New Zealand and Australia, because there's no way they can take, again, the excess of another 1.7 billion people, 1.7 billion people added to our country every year. We just can't keep doing it. It's called exponential growth, and that exponential growth is like a cancer cell. Cancer cells produce exponentially until they kill the host. And so at some point, and we're going to discuss it today, you don't have the water, you don't have the energy, you don't have the resources, you don't have the arable land, you don't have the food supply, you don't have the ability to create it. And so that is my understanding. And again, I'm a very logical, rational math and science teacher. You either work with the system, the math and the science, or it will simply destroy you. And that's what's happening. And I have facts and the numbers to prove it. 4 million children starve to death around the world right now, every year. 4 million children. Look it up on the UN starvation for teenagers and less. And then 8 million adults. And that is also documented. That's 12 million people who starve to death. And then you've got literally several billion people, if not at least 1 billion, can't even get a clean glass of water, let alone having a decent meal. And so you see, we're really starting to pile up against the facts of life, the realities of life. And when Mother Nature starts talking back to us, if you will, she's going to be very harsh, not only on humans, but also obviously very harsh on all animal and plant life on the planet. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, you're preaching to the choir. I totally agree. It has its set laws and ways that it functions.
You know what's interesting about this is the left never talks about overpopulation and immigration at the same time, which that's the real issue, right?
Well, that's correct. Well, and the left and the right don't talk about it, actually. Both of them are in cognitive dissonance, which is an intellectual denial of reality. I just received a very disconcerting email from one of my really top lieutenants, if you will, an energy expert, talking about when gasoline is going to be totally exhausted, and it's going to exhaust itself in this century. And once it's gone and there's nothing on the horizon that comes close to duplicating it, and certainly for versatility, we're in a whole lot of a world of hurt. And so I might be doing I'm going to do more research on it, but I'm going to do a national article on this about what we're facing when it comes to the energy and certainly the resources that run this civilization. But again, the United States is on course to add a total of 140 million people by 2050 from when we hit 300 million back in 2006. We're now at 330 million. We're adding over 3 million per year. And that's the ones we can count. That's not the ones we're not counting. And we're going to hit 440 million. And I can really tell you, after having traveled all through China, all through India, all through Bangladesh, they can't solve their problems. The Yangtze River, which I floated on, and the Ganges, which I floated on, are sewer pipes of contaminated and completely polluted water, so much so that they create a 20,000 square mile dead zone right there at the mouth of both those rivers, going into, of course, the Indian Ocean and all that goes with that. And yet that same poisonous water is circulating all over the planet. And so is Fukushima with all its radiated waters. So in other words, what we're doing is poisoning the nest. And the nest is our oceans. And you all know about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and well over 100 million tons of plastics that are now circulating throughout the oceans and now breaking down and getting into the fish food and getting into the tissue of the fish, killing millions of avian and also marine life. And yet there's nothing being done about it. Well, that's a metaphor for there's nothing being done about the human population either. Growing by this 80 million more babies, net gain every year, a billion every 12 years. We're really on course to exceed 10 billion by the mid-century, which is literally a heartbeat in time away from from 2018. And yet again, as you said, Mark, no conversation. And again, you all know I've tried to get on 60 Minutes for the last 20 years, and I've got impeccable credentials. I can speak clearly. I know the facts. I have written books about this. I've lived the life out there on the road to see it firsthand. And same thing with NPR, won't touch this. I've tried to get on Terry Gross. I've tried to get on Steve Inskeep and Robert Siegel on the Talk of the Nation. They won't touch it. I tried to get on Oprah when she was the national, talk show queen. She wouldn't touch it. Of course, PBS won't touch it. I almost got on PBS here in Denver a year ago when they wanted me, along with Governor Lamb, the former governor, who's also written books on this, and we've been very good friends for 30 years. And he is a brilliant, brilliant man, and he has been all over this. And they said, we'd like to have you, Frosty, and Governor Lamb, but get us a couple of pro-growth people, because we're going to talk about why we need to stop or stabilize a population here in Colorado, because we're on course to double from 5.1 million to 10 million here in the next 30 years or less. And because people are fleeing the East Coast and the West Coast just to get away from the god-awful traffic and the cramming and the jamming and the pollution and lowered quality of life and lowered standard of living and all that goes with it. And I said, well, can't you find a bunch of pro-growthers? I said, Vince Carroll of the Denver Post is pro-growth. I've battled him for 35 years. A guy named Peter Coors of Coors Brewery, he's pro-growth because he can't wait to sell more beer. And then a guy named John Caldera, who's the Independence Institute, he had me on at one point. He's all pro-growth along with all of his compadres. And then I said, or get any of the real estate people. They can't wait to grow more housing so they can make more money. And he told me, this is Aaron Arbor, who runs the PBS here in Denver, which has a California feed. He says, well, those guys are just not qualified to debate with you and Governor Lamb. I just about fell out of my chair. You know, he has not interviewed me in 20 years. And then all of a sudden he's going to give me a chance to interview. And then he tells me that they're not qualified to debate Governor Lamb and me. And of course they aren't, because I've got all the facts, and you can't battle me with emotions or hearsay or hopes or wishes or dreams. I've got the facts. And so anyway, guess what? No PBS with Aaron Arbor here in Colorado, which would have had a fantastic feed to California, because I've traveled to I'm probably the only man in the history of the United States to travel the length and width on a tour bike of California 8 times in the last 40 years. And I've seen it go from the extraordinary state that it was when there was only 15 million people. Now it's knocking on the door of 40 million, and it's going toward close to 60 million people in California.
Guys, I may be in and out. I've got a dog who's pretty sick. He's got a tumor, and we're hanging in there. He's actually doing pretty good compared to his age and what's wrong with him. So if I just kind of go quiet, you'll know what happened. There's a website called theworldcounts.com. Very interesting. It says we have 1,904,000,000 tons of waste dumped globally. 643 million tons of food lost or wasted, 49 billion tons of resources extracted from the earth. And they say in 29 years, we may literally eat up all the seafood in our oceans. This is crazy. What do you think?
Well, those numbers are pretty right on. I've got those numbers in my forthcoming book. Not only that, we dump 16 billion pounds of plastics into the oceans every year. For those of you who want to just go and see the backup on that and the support and the sources, go to www.4, the number 4, the numeral 4, OCEAN.com, 4ocean.com. It's an extraordinary company. 2 surfers got really sick and tired of surfing and all the plastic coming in on the waves worldwide. And when they got to Bali, they just were inundated by plastics in the waves themselves. And so they've started 4ocean.com. I've actually bought 5 bracelets at $20 each. They send you a bracelet and show what you're doing. And when you buy a bracelet, they will take 1 pound of plastic. They're actually paying fishermen in all these third world countries and all these islands out in the Pacific and around everywhere in 27 countries. And they're gathering pickup crews to pick up all the plastic and fish it out of the oceans. But of course, the human race is tossing 3.5 million pieces of plastic into the oceans 24/7. So it's almost like it's a Hobson's choice. There's no answer here, but at least it's a start, and I'm all for a start. And of course, what I'm proposing is a 25-cent deposit return law on all plastics that are bought and glass and cans and tin and everything out of mercantile stores worldwide. Make it an international 25-cent deposit. That way, all of the poor people and anybody that throws the stuff, it will get picked up by somebody else. And that way you would have a 99% return rate, and then we could be responsible and clean the oceans up. But as it is right now, the oceans, with what we're doing to the oceans right now, there's not going to be enough marine life left in the oceans for us to feed ourselves at some point. You're right.
You know, earlier in the week, I went out to www.bing.com. I like to use their search engine, and they had a little story there about a sperm whale that had died and drifted up on a beach somewhere in the world. And it had, I don't know, I forget exact number, 30 or 40 pounds of plastic in its stomach.
There were two of them, actually. Yeah, I followed that. And there were two whales, both sperm whales, and they both died because they had eaten literally dozens or hundreds of pounds of plastics. There's another one you could go to, and I'd have to look it up. It's called This Heart Within Me Burns, and it's about Midway Island. I actually can send you the video. I've had it on my website, and I've had it on my Facebook page. But a photographer and a videographer went to Midway. Now, Midway is out there in the Pacific, 2,000 miles from anything. And yet all of the waved albatross, and I've seen the waved albatross on the Galapagos Islands when I visited the Galapagos Islands. And of course, plastics are all over the Galapagos Islands too. Anyway, the waved albatross, they're so big and so fat, they're going extinct. They have to jump off a cliff just to get airborne, but then they can sail around for days, weeks actually. And what happened was on this Midway Island, all of these waved albatross and all of these other birds like frigate birds, and frigate birds are beautiful. I've seen these guys in flight. They got like 7-8 foot wingspans. They're just extraordinary. They're dying from eating all the bottle caps, and they'll eat Bic lighters, and they'll eat toothbrushes, and they'll eat little plastic forks, because all this stuff floats on the ocean. And so they're dying, and he shows all these birds as he takes pictures of them and then takes a movie of them, and then you see the plastic is everywhere in their nesting area. So you can see the extraordinary irresponsibility of humans on this planet. And again, I'm a child of the 60s. I mean, I started college in 65, and I'll never forget, it was 67 when Dustin Hoffman played in The Graduate, a movie that he was having an affair. Anyway, it was a movie, and one of the guys said, listen, Dustin, whatever his name was back then, it's plastics, man. You got to get into plastics. Plastics are the future. Well, I was a scuba diver, and I started scuba diving in 1963, and I can tell you what, the oceans were beautiful, and I've scuba dived all over the world in all the last 54 years, and honest to God, we have trashed the oceans. They are no longer beautiful. There's more garbage and filth and drift nets and plastic cans and bottles. They're in the kelp beds. They're floating everywhere. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, 100 million tons of plastic the size of Texas floating 1,000 miles off of San Francisco between two gyres. Gyres, some people call them gyres. There's two ocean currents that literally lock them right in. And literally millions of seabirds die, millions of all these different turtles. Turtles eat the styrofoam, and then they can't dive because they float. And it's in their gut, and so then they die of starvation because they can't dive. And that's what humans are doing to the rest of the world with this plastic onslaught of the oceans.
Yeah, you're aware of the extinction event that's taking place as well, right?
I certainly am. For those of you who have known about, there have been 5 extinction sessions. They call them an extinction session. And there's been 5 of them that have killed off, the last one was the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, and 97% of all life died during that nuclear winter created by a massive crashing of meteors that became, meteorites that became, and they crashed and caused a nuclear winter, and that's what took out. And then there's been 2 or 3, or I can't remember how many ice ages. But anyway, the last one, again, was the nuclear winter that took out the dinosaurs, and that took out 97% of everything. And then from that 3% that survived that, the human race actually popped up, and all of the creatures you see on the planet. Well, right now, according to the latest statistics, and I deal with it with one of my chapters in my book, we're in the sixth, the number 6, the 6th extinction session, and it's being driven by human beings. And we're losing somewhere, according to the Norman Meier Oxford University 40-year study, and I attended that lecture 30-something years ago, we're losing between 80 and 100 species a day now, 24/7. Now, there's about 30 million species on the planet. from all the latest. There's some that haven't been discovered, but around 30 million. But we're taking them out at about 80 to 100 per day. And E.O. Wilson, the great Harvard professor of biology, stated that by 2050, which is a heartbeat in time from now, the human race could wipe out at least a third of all species on the planet. So yeah, the sixth extinction session is just doing its thing, and we humans are the ones that are driving that extinction rate at this 21st century point in time.
You know, overpopulation, immigration, destruction of the forests around the world, destruction of wildlife, plastics, hunger. These are the kind of topics they should be talking about on the mainstream media and not all the other nonsense.
You're correct, Mark. They should be talking about this as the number one priority. You know, I found it quite disconcerting that in 17 years we've wasted $5.9 trillion over in Iraq and Afghanistan just killing people.
Yeah.
$5.9 trillion. Does anyone appreciate what you could do with $5.9 trillion? Turned it into, organized ecological research on viable alternative energy, turning the wind energy and the sun energy and solar power and wave energy and river energy into a finely tuned, possible, viable alternative to oil. And yet, unfortunately, that's not been going on. We're doing absolutely nothing. In fact, the military-industrial complex does everything it can to keep these wars going, and we're not dealing with what we should be dealing with, and that would be a full-fledged, 100% thrust forward on alternative energies that are going to be viable for the 21st century when oil runs out. And I have a whole chapter on that we will be discussing here this winter. And it's going to run out. And without the versatility and the viability of an alternative energy, we're going to be in a lot of trouble.
Now, I forget the exact figure. Did you say it was $4.5 trillion?
It was 5.9 trillion wasted in Afghanistan and Iraq in the last 17 years of those two wars. 5.9 trillion.
Now, with like 5.9 trillion, couldn't you like provide everybody with housing in the whole U.S. or some crazy thing like that?
Oh, not only could you have provided you could have gone into the ghettos and you could have built beautiful, well-appointed schools. You could have built incredible recreation centers for all of these children and their parents. You could have educated the parents. You could have had after-school classes. You could have had you could have created jobs with $5.9 trillion. And a lot of times in the inner cities with people that have intellectual challenges, you could have built and really re-engineered redundant jobs to fit all of these Americans who are having a hard time, to the tune of giving them some dignity, giving them a job, giving them ability to come home to a decent place to live. We could have re-engineered cities to be walking-centric and bicycle-centric instead of car-centric. Anyone been to Chicago lately? I mean, I've been to Chicago this fall. It's a nightmare. Detroit's a nightmare. Atlanta's a nightmare. New York City's a nightmare. Boston is a horrific nightmare. Miami's a nightmare. Certainly Denver, where I live right now, is a nightmare. LA is a triple nightmare. Dallas and Houston are just total nightmares. So we could have done so much more to solve the problems in our country with $5.9 trillion rather than just blow people up in this ridiculous chase after, well, it's from one week to another. It's this ISIS, and then next it's the Taliban, then it's the insurgents, and then it's this, and then it's that, and it's all a bunch of baloney. I mean, I'm a former U.S. Army officer, and I can tell you Vietnam was a bunch of baloney, and these two wars right now are just even more baloney, and yet we should be spending that money on our country and our citizens rather than the military-industrial complex.
Solon, do you have any comments or questions?
No, I mean, this is just a lot to take in, though I think I've heard a lot of this before, but I'm super happy you're talking about this, Frosty. It needs to be known.
Well, thank you. Again, I'm always the positive thinker with a realistic understanding. And in this first chapter of my book, America's Accelerating Population Predicament, I talk about the exponential growth consequences. Let me go over a few of them right now.
Sure.
The Nobel laureate, Dr. Henry W. Kendall said, and I'm quoting, "If we don't halt population growth with justice and compassion, it will be done for us by nature, brutally and without pity, and will leave a ravaged world," unquote. And my question is, and my whole book is loaded with, every chapter leads off with this powerful, a Nobel laureate, a top person in the world that makes these brilliant quotes. And what happens when somebody of that magnitude of intellect makes a quote like that? Do you just sit here and ignore it? Well, guess what? Pretty much the human race, and certainly America, has ignored that brilliant poet laureate's quote and just steamed ahead, all these last 35, 40 years since 1970, when we at that time said, we got to take care of the earth. And so the problem is, we have simply ignored the reality. And whether you talk about the water shortages, which I cover, and there's 7 states right now with water shortages, and yet nobody's talking about population stabilization. They talk about more conservation. Well, we got to have more conservation. Well, we got to be more careful with our rivers. We got to be more careful with how we take a shower. Well, that's not the solution, because that solution won't do any good when you add another 100 million people to the U.S. population. And so what I try to bring about is an understanding that if we either do something positive that brings solution, or we suffer what, and I don't know if any of you read Jared Diamond's book, and I have it right here in my library. It's called Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. And Jared Diamond, of course, is a Pulitzer Prize winner. And he wrote, I think it was Guns, Diamonds, and something or other, was his previous book. But he went after the Easter Island, which you all know about. That's the perfect example of a system that collapsed, a microcosm of human collapse because of overpopulation. The Mayan Empire was a slash and burn, and it collapsed. The Incas were pretty much they were destroyed by Pizarro, the Spanish guy that came in there with guns and pretty much tore them up. The Anasazi, they collapsed because they ran out of water. The drought came in and pretty much dissipated them. You've got Rwanda, of course, starving themselves to death because they chose overpopulation. And Haiti, of course, is in a mess. And it's a complete mess because they're overpopulated. I mean, they got 9 million people on a little spit of land out there in the Caribbean, and they're headed for 12 million, and they've cut down 98% of their trees, and they want somebody else to save them.
Let me jump in here in a minute. And Solon, you may know something about this. I have been looking into, well, I got about 2.5 acres here, and I think I've got 30 trees up, and I want more. So I've been looking into growing seedlings. Have you done any of that, Solon? Have you ever, say, grown seedlings in the winter inside your house and then planted them in the spring?
Yeah. Well, typically it's towards the end of the winter. Yeah, you do that for an annual garden. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I'm talking about growing trees. I thought I would start out with pine trees. Have you ever done anything like this, Frosty?
Well, yes, I plant trees on I have an acre of property here behind my house, and I plant trees and have grown. You can't see out of my back deck because I've got trees growing everywhere. I've got evergreens because I live at 7,500 feet up in the Rocky Mountains. But you can't grow enough trees because they're being destroyed worldwide at such a horrendous rate of speed. So every tree you plant is a big plus for the planet.
Let me throw this out as a question. This will be fun. Estimate. I'd like to hear from both of you guys. How many fires we had in California this year? Solon, take a wild guess.
I'm going to say 35.
I think it was over 100.
No. 7,579 fires during 2018 that burned a total of 1.6 million acres. Now I'm going to have to verify that number. I know that sounds outrageous, but I'm pretty sure that we've been sticking up in the thousands of fires in California. If even back 10, 15 years, there were thousands and thousands of fires each California fire season. But what's different about the recent one is, like, if you go back to 2005, we burned up 2,200,000 acres in the wildfires. This year, it was 1.6 million acres. And the only reason I think that the people are really paying attention to it is because of the so-called campfire this year, which burned up 11,800 structures. See, now people's buildings are being burned up, so they're paying attention.
Well, there's no question, and of course, I bicycled right down the whole length of the West Coast this summer, and even last summer in 2017, I started on the coast and I went east on the Lewis and Clark Trail across the northern tier all the way to Bar Harbor, Maine, from Astoria, Oregon, on the coast there, and I got caught in that 260,000 acre fire in Montana, and I mean, I thought the world was coming to an end. For 6 hours, I was breathing nothing but smoke coming out of Great Falls, Montana, and then through Mosby. And then for that day, I'll never forget, fire was coming right down to the road, and they threatened to cut the road off again. And it was blackened 360 degrees. We saw cows that didn't outrun the fire, got burned up, and carcasses and all that goes with that.
It's apocalyptic, isn't it?
Well, it really is. And again, you have to understand, the more population you have, the more the population is going to be caught in this kind of apocalyptic situation. And again, I don't know how California right now survives at all with 40 million people. It's just short of 40 million, about 39 million. It's people everywhere. The grass is completely brown most of the year, and it's dry as a bone, and yet they add 1,655 people every single day of the year. Gosh. On their way to adding 20 million more people. And you can look that up on capsweb.org. 98% of that 1,655 people is both legal and illegal immigration. And so, California is one hell of an apocalyptic future right now. And yet you will not see Mr. Moonbeam, Jerry Brown, or Dianne Feinstein, who's a space cadet, ever speak to any of this, because they simply are, they're totally out of touch with what's going on in California. You've got leaders out there, whether it's Nancy Pelosi, who is a complete helium head airhead, who doesn't know what's going on in this country. She's 77 or 78 years old. Feinstein is 84, and she just got reelected. No, I think she's 86. Anyway, these people don't know what's going on. They don't have the intellectual understanding to grasp what's going on in their own state, and yet they literally promote more immigration. They promote more a complete usurpation of our borders, and that's what kind of leaders we have, and the people that vote them into office. You sit there and you go, where is your brain? Well, obviously they're not using it.
Well,
go ahead.
It seems to me that the people of the U.S. are losing their ability for independent thinking. Have you noticed
critical
that?
thinking?
Critical thinking, independent thinking. It's like whatever the mainstream media says, they just kind of go along with it, and they stay in this. They're like in a daze or something.
Well, they are, and even Tucker Carlson, whom I think is one of the best reporters and journalists out there, he has completely ignored me for the last, certainly the last 2 years or so. He's been on that show, and before that time, and all these guys have a whole lot, they're younger guys, and even the women. Martha McCallum, I've tried to get on her show. I've tried to get on with Ann Coulter, who's funny but serious, and yet none of them want to touch this. Let me give you this. Walter Youngquist just passed away, one of the greatest experts on energy, and I'll be when I get to his chapter, we'll quote him. But he said, and I'm quoting, "This is going to be an interesting decade, for the perfect storm is brewing: energy, immigration, and oil imports. China grows in direct confrontation for the remaining oil. I think the USA is on a big, slippery downhill slope. Will the thin veneer of civilization survive?" Unquote.
I think that's what the issue is, because I really think our civilization could collapse, and people do not have that even in their mind as a possibility. But if we continue on the path that we're on, I see literally our civilization collapsing.
Well, then you would be very correct. I have come up with the summation myself with all the facts and figures I have. And the three big things that are going to collapse this country are lack of water, lack of gasoline, and of course, lack of resources. And when you take those, in fact, I'm speaking in January and February to two big political groups here in Denver. And my program is titled The Perfect Storm Gathering Over America. And what I talk about is the population, the sociological chaos of mixing all of these disparate and incompatible cultures to the tune of 100 million people. And then, of course, the resources and the environment. These three things are creating the perfect storm. He's talked about energy, immigration, and imports. I'm talking about the sociological impact. I'm talking about water. And then in the end, I'm talking about resources, and the collapse of that will be the United States at some point. And I would agree with you. That's exactly what we're heading toward.
Now, another thing that could happen is civil war. How do you think that's going to play out? Like the federal government sending troops into California for whatever reason, and then that turns into kind of a armed struggle. Have you played any of these scenarios out in your mind yet?
I certainly have. One of the things that we're going to see, and we're already seeing it, is tribalism will return, and the tribalism will be, and it's already started. I mean, you've got horrendous tribalism in, say, Black Lives Matter. You've got tremendous tribalism in La Raza, which is the Mexicans, the race and nothing but the race. You've got tribalism with the Muslims. They are an extraordinarily tribal ethnic group, a religion and ethnic group. And then you've got what's left is the Caucasian Americans, who are right now backing up and running away from just about every situation here in the United States. You don't find any European Americans, Caucasians moving into Southwest Chicago. They're not moving into New York City. They're certainly not moving into Miami right now. I can tell you, I've been down to Miami. I've seen Miami change from an all-American city 40 years ago to virtually no one speaks English down there anymore, because all of the whites that do speak English, all the Americans that used to be there they're fled, and they're up and down the coastlines north of there, but they're not in Miami. Same thing happening in Houston. Same thing happening in Dallas and Fort Worth. So what was happening is, and as a matter of fact, the former mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, called for the 5 African states of America.
What?
He died a year ago, I think, about a year ago. But he had a lot of supporters when he was the mayor of Jackson, and I got his name. I could look it up for you. But he wants to start the Black Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina. He wanted to make the 5 African states of America, called America, the K-A. So yeah, we're going to see a lot of tribalism as these scarcities come to fruition, at the water, the energy, and the resources.
Just to let both of you guys know, I think we got about 5 minutes left or so. Frosty, I have your book, America on the Brink, but you're working on a new one, right?
That's correct. And I'm going a step further with the new one with some really harsher realities than that one. America on the Brink shows you what's going to happen with 100 million more added Americans. But on this one, I'm talking more about the sociological impact of fracturing and fragmenting the American culture into this multicultural and diversity morass. It's never worked in the history of humanity. It's not working now, and it sure as heck is not going to work when there's another 100 million people from 196 different countries who have fled to America to save their desperate lives. But with them, they are bringing 196 different worldviews, 196 different languages, 196 different cultures, and certainly 196 different ways of life. And when you throw that into a giant cauldron, you are going to get a real nasty response, and especially a pressure cooker cauldron. At some point, it's either going to completely melt down in total failure, or it's going to blow up. It's going to explode on all of us. And my suspicion is it's going to really blow up and explode on everybody. And it's not going to be fun for anybody here in this country here in another 10 to 20 years from now.
You know, to me, it's like we don't even really have a civilization anymore, or we're a civilization that's in decline. Would you agree with that?
Yes, we are. There's no question. We're a civilization in decline. We've lost the cohesive ethos, if you will, that we're all Americans, because we're not all Americans. The Hispanic, Latino, Mexican group, the La Raza group, will be the new majority by 2042. That's what, 4 years from now? And so Spanish will be the heck, in Los Angeles right now, there are 6 TV stations that are all nothing but Spanish and 22 radio shows.
You got to be kidding me.
Oh, I'm not kidding you. I was there. I counted them.
You know, you're telling me TV stations that do nothing but broadcast in Spanish?
Same thing in Houston. Houston's got 5 TV stations and over, I think, about 15 radio shows that are all in Spanish. Yep.
I have never, ever heard this before. I'm shocked by this.
Yeah. Well, go to Detroit and you'll see the Muslims have radio and TV that's all Muslim and all in Arabic. And that's in Detroit, Michigan. Yeah.
That seems to me that should be illegal.
It should be illegal because when you lose the cohesive aspect of language for any country, you will ultimately lose the country itself. It will fracture and fragment, and there's no putting it back together, just like Humpty Dumpty.
Isn't that like a historical fact that's happened? They've seen that happen over and over again.
Yep, over and over and over again. When you look at the Romans, it took them about 400 years to finally fall, whereas it's only going to take us less than 100 because of the difference in speed of having all these refugees come in. But the Franks, the Anglos, the Visigoths, the Goths, the Saxons all came into Rome, came down into Italy, and they were known as the barbarians, but they infiltrated the military, then they infiltrated the shops, and then finally there was no way to keep it all together because the languages were so different, and then Rome fell in 375 AD or whatever it was. I think it was 375 AD. Well, if you look what's happening here, in Denver alone, we have 173 different languages in Denver public schools. There's 800 languages spoken daily in New York City because almost 40% of New York City is foreign born. Can you imagine? There's about 44 million people in this country right now are foreign born, and they're all legal immigrants. But get what happens when there's another 100 million foreign born in this country, because that's what it's going to be in another 30 years. You will no longer have the United States of America. It's going to be the disunited States of America, or the fragmented United States of America, because it certainly won't be the United States of America.
Folks, we're out of time. Thanks so much, Frosty. Thanks, Solon. Have a great evening, guys.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.